Hello. Welcome to Stories in Time. I'm very glad you've come today. My name is Ellouise Schoettler. You know, we all have a story. Are you aware of the fact that you walk around wearing a story all the time? Oh, it is true. Your name is your first story. Your parents give it to you as soon as you're born. And they know the story of why they chose the names that they gave you and who they named you for. And that becomes your story. Unless, like my dad, I went to check up on him when I was doing genealogy, and I went to look at his birth certificate, and lo and behold, he was no name Diggle. For the first 12 days, he didn't have a name. He was just little old no name. And that's because he was the third boy. And he came sooner than they expected him. And so they weren't ready with a name to pop right out there. But they did have a name within 12 days, Robert Bernard. I have a story about my name. My name is Ellouise. But if you've ever noticed, my mother spelled it a little bit differently. It's E-L-L-O-U-I-S-E, 2 L's. I'm named for 2 grandmothers. I was the first daughter, her first child, her first daughter, and she named me for both grandmothers, Ellie, her mother, and Louise, my father's mother. So if I wanted to tell you the story of my name, I could go off in 2 directions and tell you about either one of those women. Both are pretty interesting. My middle name is Schoettler. Schoettler was my mother's father, Gus Schoettler, who died when she was only 18 months old. He was from South Carolina, and he died young, and my grandmother grieved so hard for him that she never told any stories about him. So I did not know until I was 50 years old and was deep into genealogy. I didn't know his story. But when I went down to South Carolina to find out about him, well, they knew all about him. He was an early football player, 1904, 1905 at Clemson University, and he played under John Heisman. Well, they handed me a folk hero to bring back to my children. You never know what you're going to find out if you start looking at your name for your clues. The other thing about your name, or asking somebody else for their name, it's a great icebreaker. You walk into a class, you go into a party, you don't know anybody, ask people about their names. You don't know the stories that you will hear, and I'm going to tell you how I know that. I was telling stories a couple of years ago. I was asked to come and tell stories at the birthday party for a 90-year-old extraordinary woman. And so I told family stories and all, and then I included in that the story of your name, that your name is your first story, knowing that I was going to ask the birthday girl to stand up and tell this group, about 100 people, what the story of her name was. Well, when I turned to her and said, could you tell us the story of your name? She took the microphone right away and started in. I know the story of my name. My name is Thelma. And when I was born, my mother was reading a novel. It was a novel about a girl who lived in Norway. She was a poor girl, barely had anything. But when she grew up, she married a prince, and she became a princess of Norway. Her name was Thelma. My mother thought that that was a pretty good thing for me to be named, because it would give me something to work for to find my prince. But what many people don't know is that I also have a middle name. My first name is Thelma, My second name is Louise. So all of my life I've been Thelma Louise, long before there was a movie. Now at that crowd just broke up laughing. And they turned and they were chatting with one another very quickly, and I said, well, let's take advantage of this chatting you're doing. Turn to the person next to you and tell them the story of your name. And they did. You could hear it all over the room, these stories that were being exchanged, things that even though they lived in this place together, was an assisted living facility, they lived there together, they didn't know these things about each other. And within minutes, they had a whole different take on a person they'd known for a very long time. Afterwards, a woman came up to me and she said, I'll tell you the story of my name. I bet you've never heard a story like the story of my name. And I said, well, go ahead. I'm waiting. Well, I'm from North Carolina. Now, I am too, so right away I was even more interested than I had been a second before. I'm from North Carolina. You probably have never heard of the little town that I'm from. It's down near Wilmington, almost to South Carolina. It's called Bolivia. That took me back for a minute. I mean, I thought Bolivia was a country, but she's telling me that Bolivia is a small town on the coast of North Carolina. So I said, well, no, I don't know Bolivia. She said, well, that's where I was born. I'm 87 years old, so it was a few years ago. But when it came time and my mother went into labor, they called for the midwife because that's how they did it down in the country, down in Bolivia, North Carolina. And the midwife came and my mother labored all day and into the night. Now, she started out in her laboring in the middle of the day or the early afternoon, and that was December the 1st. And it went on, and it got darker and darker. And I was born many hours later in the dark. And they weren't real sure whether I was born on December the 1st or December the 2nd. And the confusion came because my mother had been so busy in labor delivering me that she hadn't wound the big grandfather clock and reset it. So it had stopped, and they didn't know what time it was. Well, when the midwife wrote down the information, they decided that it must have been December the 2nd before it got light. So they made it around 4 o'clock in the morning. And my mother told the midwife, her name is Ina, I-N-A. Her name is Ina. And the midwife wrote it down. So there I was. I wasn't sure whether it was the 1st or the 2nd. And my name was Ina. And it never bothered me too much that I didn't have a birth certificate. You see, in those days, if you were born at home and the midwife did all the paperwork and sent it in to the state, you didn't really have a birth certificate, but you were recorded. And it didn't bother me at all until I was about 35 years old and I was working, and they wanted a birth certificate. So I got all the information together, my parents' names, the date, where it was, the name of the midwife, for December the 2nd. And I sent it to Raleigh, to the Vital Records Department, and asked them to send me a birth certificate. They wrote me back. There was no girl, Ina, born on December the 2nd to my parents in Bolivia, North Carolina. But there was a boy born on December the 1st to my parents, whose name was Ira, I-R-A. That's me, born on December the 1st. and the midwife had transcribed my name wrong. So they changed it. They changed the date, and they changed my sex. And I bet I'm the only one that ever went to the state of North Carolina and on the same day had both their name and the sex changed on their birth certificate. We were standing there laughing and laughing. And she turned and she touched me on the arm and she says, "But I'll tell you one thing. My husband told me he wasn't fooled. He knew I wasn't a boy all along." And then she just went off in peals of laughter again. You don't know what you're likely to learn from somebody's name. Try it. Collect those stories. Thank you for coming. I hope you'll come back. We'll have more stories for you next week.